He bucked many of the prevailing trends of the 20th century, and in so doing produced a catalog of works ranging from the recital hall to horror films. I'm the Classical Nerd, and today we're talking about György Ligeti. Ligeti was born in Hungary in 1923. Growing up, he wanted to be a violinist, like his father had been as a boy, but his father was against it, despite the family regularly attending symphony orchestra concerts and operatic productions. He practiced the piano at the house of a friend, but this began when he was a teenager, and while he always wanted to be a concert pianist, he never felt like he had started early enough for that dream to be realized. But the piano opened up a new world for him, one of composition. He was banned from studying physics at a university due to the rising anti-Semitism, but he was able to get into a conservatory, which he did at the age of 18. But World War II came, and in 1944 he was drafted into the forced labor service, essentially becoming a slave carrying munitions to the front lines. But he was one of the lucky ones, as most of his family was rounded up and shipped off to die in the Holocaust. When the war ended, he was able to complete his musical training at a far more prestigious conservatory, the Franz Liszt Academy of Music, where he later was to become a professor. Hungarian artists of the time fed off of both East and West. With the fall of the Iron Curtain, Soviet censorship began to rise. Ligeti himself suffered under Soviet censorship, with the second movement of his Sonata for Solo Cello being banned for being too dissonant, I suppose. Fortunately for Ligeti, he had done some ethnomusicological research in the year between his graduation from the Franz Liszt Conservatory and his entrance to the conservatory as a professor. When Ligeti was at the conservatory as a professor, he made a point of attending lectures given by more senior professors, because he still knew he had much to learn. Under continuous threat of censorship, he began experimenting ever more, as if to build a new kind of music from nothing, he would later say. His 11-movement piano suite, Musica Ricercata, was to become most evocative of this early experimental style, where each movement uses one more pitch class than the previous. The first movement uses only 2 different notes, while this last movement uses all 12 notes in a chromatic fugue-like texture known as a ricercar, from whence the entire piano suite gets its name. Due to Soviet censorship, he was not particularly familiar with the kinds of breakthroughs and innovations that the serialists of the West were beginning to experiment with, and his own experiments with trying to do different things with very limited amount of compositional room to deal with, his own self-imposed limitations, led him to an idiom resembling that of Bela Bartok. And he did not like this, because for him Bela Bartok meant that he was just following in the footsteps of the past. Also, the Soviets had sort of co-opted Bela Bartok's life and his works. Even though they banned his more dissonant works, he was considered to be the ideal Hungarian artist by the regime. Despite its presence in the repertoire, Ligeti considered Musica Ricercata a result of naive and half-baked compositional ideas. When Ligeti arranged 6 of the movements of Musica Ricercata as 6 bagatelles for wind quintet, the final movement, the 12-note ricercar, was actually banned by the Soviets. At this point, he realized that something just had to change. He had to get out from such an artistically repressive environment. It was the German avant-garde composer Karlheinz Stockhausen that actually was the key to Ligeti's escape from communism. Stockhausen had arranged for a scholarship for Ligeti to study with him in Cologne, and he had also been in contact with Ligeti through the mail. Ligeti left Budapest in the winter of 1956, being smuggled out by trains and mail wagons, and eventually a mad dash across a night sky lit up with the fire from Soviet missiles, because the Hungarian Revolution was going on, and the whole country was war-torn. But through this, Ligeti and his wife escaped to Vienna. Ligeti kept with him the highlights of his compositional career, leaving most of his early works behind to presumably be destroyed in Budapest. He eventually fell into the New German School, where groundbreaking electronic music and serialist pioneers such as Karlheinz Stockhausen accepted him in their electronic music studio in Cologne. He was not particularly interested in their brand of purely electronic music, although he did synthesize a few works in that idiom. He preferred instead to work on his own ideas at his own pace. And in fact, his early works, his early breakout works, such as Apparitions and Atmospheres, had their basis in him trying to create or rather recreate, electronic sounds in the context of a full symphony orchestra. And in doing so, Ligety developed compositional practices that he was to use throughout most of the rest of his career. Unlike his more seriously minded colleagues, the few purely electronic pieces that Ligety wrote exploited the inherently humorous timbres and textures you could get out of these early synthesizers. He said that he thought of music holistically, imagining a piece in total before committing pen to paper. By breaking with tradition and eschewing the traditional concepts, Ligety had finally found his own style. Several terms are key to understanding Ligety's mature style: micro-polyphony and non-atonality. Both of these went against the grain of his colleagues, who were more or less trapped by the strict confines of serialism. Micro-polyphony is basically an enormously compressed canon, and it often shows up in his large ensemble music. Unlike traditional polyphony, which has rules that establish a strict separation of voices, that you can hear 2, 3, 4, 5 different voices going on at one time, micro-polyphony actually eschews this intentionally. Instead, Ligety uses this on a level that makes the music sound like a gigantic and constantly shifting tone cluster. And because it's often found in a vocal setting, it makes Ligety's music an incredible challenge to vocalists who want to perform it. While other composers who look to the pre-Baroque for inspiration often look to the strict contrapuntal procedures of Palestrina, Ligety said that he preferred Requiem for his sense of continuity. Ligety's views of atonality, essentially the language of every composer who is taken seriously in the academic compositional world, was much more nuanced than that of many of his colleagues. Ligety's music can rarely, if ever, be called tonal, but he doesn't actively try to avoid tonal relationships or tonal implications. Modern theorists might call someone working in Ligety's idiom a pan-tonal composer, but Ligety himself really never bothered with labels such as that. The earliest work of his in the repertoire, the aforementioned Sonata for Solo Cello, uses a combination of folk melodies and free atonality. His explorations of atonal sound worlds were so markedly different from that of other composers because he wasn't bound by the strict limitations of 12-tone music or strict serialism. He said that he had found serialism interesting, but it was simply too dogmatic for his purposes. He even went so far as to pointedly critique Structures 1A, the two-piano total serialist work of Pierre Boulez, who was one of the most influential and one of the meanest composers of the era. Beginning in the 1970s, Ligety felt like he was coming to an impasse. Or perhaps even more importantly, that the emphasis that composers felt on musical pitch and harmony was perhaps misguided. He wrote his only opera, Le Grand Macabre, in 1977, and thereafter found himself in what could only be called a compositional funk. He found himself unable to write music in his previous style, but he was also unsure of where to go. "I am in a prison. One wall is the avant-garde, the other wall is the past, and I want to escape," he once told his students. As a consequence of his aforementioned de-emphasis of pitch, he began to focus ever more on rhythm. He would add a note here, subtract a note there, superimpose different rhythms, or use larger ensembles to create more complex rhythmic groups, as well as imitating machinery and studying the metric polyrhythms of Chopin and Schumann and Brahms and even Franz Liszt. In fact, Ligety's love of Brahms led him to write a horn trio, which broke him out of his compositional funk, and it was neo-romantic enough to cause the avant-garde fits. This sense of neo-romanticism continued on throughout much of the rest of his career. In fact, in his nonsense madrigals, he conceived of a kind of new diatonicism that was neither tonal nor atonal. To accomplish this, he might, for instance, use a traditional major, minor, or seventh chord harmony, but they weren't going to be used in their traditional ways. They were completely non-functional and thus were used simply for color, and not for any sort of creating harmonic tension or progressions. He had hit upon a unique style, and in doing so, actually solved a problem that went back to Arnold Schoenberg himself, who wrote in 1926, "I believe that to use the consonant chords too is not out of the question, as soon as someone has found a technical means of either satisfying or paralyzing their formal claims." Ligety had single-handedly solved this problem. Ligety's fascination with rhythm can be traced back to the early 1960s, when he poked fun at musical elitism by writing a piece he ostentatiously titled Poème Symphonique, and it was written for 100 metronomes. He also wrote a piece for solo harpsichord entitled Hungarian Rock, that was basically a parody of standard harmonic chord progressions found in popular music. For all of his seriousness, Ligety could write hilarious music with the best of them, like a 20th century incarnation of Joseph Haydn. He hated the pretentiousness and the backstabbing of the modern music scene so much that on one occasion when he was invited to give a 10-minute lecture, he turned that into an opportunity where he simply wrote absurdist statements on a chalkboard. And similarly to Haydn, Ligety was an economical composer. He was able to fashion entire pieces out of basic concepts. In fact, much of Ligety's best music comes from his ability to take a very simple idea and spin it out until it falls apart by weight of its own complexity. This is exemplified in his piano etudes, some of his last major pieces in a set that he worked on up until his death, where each piece has its own distinct idea that he works out in a way that is terrifyingly difficult for the performer. The very first etude, Desordre, French for disorder, features the right hand playing only white keys and the left hand only the black, and as the piece unfolds, they slowly go out of sync with each other. The next etude, Cordes à vide, French for open strings, has flowing lines of open fifths that get progressively faster and more layered. The fifth etude takes much from jazz. The sixth works out up to 5 simultaneous rhythmic layers, and the seventh etude, entitled Galamborang, is imitative of the Balinese gamelan that he had heard in the 1970s, through having each hand stick to one of the 2 unique whole-tone scales available on the piano. Taken as a whole, they're more compositional etudes than etudes that, say, a pianist-composer might write. He stacks accents upon accents, and dynamics range from 8 Ps to 8 Fs, all of which tell us that he's working with smaller dynamic gradients than most composers. Pianist Jeremy Dink said of this practice, "If 7 fortes is like being disemboweled by a wolf, then 8 is like being disemboweled by a bear." The etudes led to the apotheosis of this style, the piano concerto, which follows the same conceptualization as the etudes, but works them out on the grandest canvas, piano and orchestra. He also further deconstructed pitch, working his way out of traditional 12-tone Western tunings by instructing horns to play in natural harmonics, or incorporating slide whistles and ocarinas into his pieces. He was careful to avoid notation that was too precise, and he saw this music as distinctly different from, say, trying to produce exact equal-tempered quarter tones, as was the interest of Czech composer Alois Hába, whose music was familiar to Ligety. He was to work on the piano etudes intermittently throughout his life, and the set was actually left incomplete at his death. The late works used ever more unusual ensembles and instrumentations, from the wide-ranging sonata for solo viola to a song cycle for voice and for percussionists with a title that I simply can't pronounce. This rhythmic and percussive focus was in no small part due to Ligety's admiration for traditional African drumming, which he was exposed to via a Puerto Rican student of his in the 1980s. The basic concept of African polyrhythm, that is, superimposition onto a fast and unrelenting pulse, wormed its way into his music. But he didn't use it outright, he rather used it as a building block. He could use this concept and this technique to build complex webs and textures of sound, just by using rhythm. This got so complex that he had to color code everything when he was composing just to keep track of different rhythmic layers. Ligety saw kindred spirits in Renaissance composers, who lived and worked before Western music settled into its concepts of meter and rhythm, as well as the music of Conlon Nancaro, an American expatriate living in Mexico City who took to player piano rolls to realize his often unplayable and completely irrational tempos. Now, I've talked about irrational time signatures before, but we're talking about actual irrational tempos, where the time signature might include pi or a square root of 2. Ligety considered Nancaro the best composer alive, in no small part probably because Nancaro embodied the kind of rhythmic nuance that Ligety sought to incorporate back into Western music. Ligety's music is perhaps best known to audiences through its close association with the films of Stanley Kubrick, as I have discussed on this channel before. He never expressed the desire to be first and foremost in anything, and disliked the jockeying he saw amongst the new school of composers who always wanted to be the first to break this or that new ground. He was able to go against many prevailing trends to forge a strongly idiosyncratic style that could assimilate everything from traditional African drumming to Balinese gamelan to Renaissance music to player piano rolls. He always pushed himself to write something new, but he was always still able to stay humble towards his international fame.